Alright, how's everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we check out great theories of everything and go very, very deep into them and try to mine them for everything that they're worth to help us with our paradigm shifting, our awakening to 5D consciousness, and our formation of a holistic worldview. Today's our 561st video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey Bernard Larson. And Mr. Larson lived from 1898 until 1990. And during his long life, he wrote a lot of books and articles on mostly scientific subjects like physics and chemistry and astronomy, but he also has an offering on metaphysics, which includes sections on philosophy, religion, psychology, biology, and he's got 2 books on economics, and they're all based on the same theory. So he's got one theory and he plugs it into every subject. Larson was one of the few scientists to propose a cosmology based on motion. Not matter, not energy, not force, but motion. Larson's first postulate from his 1959 kind of announcement was that the universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions in discrete units and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. And he goes from there. And through a process of deduction, arrives at a theoretical universe and compares his theoretical universe with the empirical universe of modern science. He does that in books such as Basic Properties of Matter, where he compares his theoretical equations for things like the melting point of matter, different forms of matter, or the compressibility or the specific heat, with the scientific tables that are already existing. In many cases, Larson is able to recreate the scientific tables strictly from theory. But then he also goes into subjects like economics, where he takes the economic system and, kind of puts it into motion and then breaks it down to its most fundamental principles and tries to strip away all of the politics and sociology of it and get down to the actual mechanism and how to manipulate the mechanism before we start to try to impose the philosophical or psychological or sociological political preferences that we might have. First, the economic system has to comply with the laws of physics. Okay, now if you'd like to get a more fundamental understanding of the reciprocal system, watch one of my, or more than one of my first 474 videos on the subject. And if you want to get to the start of this book, go back about 6 weeks in the archives with chapter 1. But right now we're in the middle of chapter 17 of this book on economics from Larson that is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. And this chapter is called The Dollar Abroad. We started it yesterday, so we're about a third of the way into it. And we're going to get through this middle section here today. The arbitrary official exchange rates cannot be maintained for more than a relatively short time in any event. The farther the official rate gets away from the true ratio of values, the more difficult it becomes to hold it, and sooner or later it is necessary to revise it upward. The actual effect of controlling the exchange rate, therefore, is not to prevent adjustment of the currency values to more realistic levels, but to cause the adjustments to take place in sudden jumps rather than by slow and gradual changes. The damage that is done to what would otherwise be a profitable international trade is a high price to pay for the very dubious advantage of being able to administer economic medicine in big doses rather than small doses. It is true that the present state of international finance is far from satisfactory. Far too many nations are unable to generate the foreign exchange needed to pay for imports and meet their commitments with respect to their international debts. There is a tendency to blame the monetary exchange system for this shortage, and efforts are being made by the economists and money managers to devise some kind of cure for the ailments. One experiment now being tried in a rather half-hearted way is the creation of a kind of international currency in the form of special drawing rights, which nations can draw upon when they run out of foreign exchange. This experiment has not accomplished its objective. On the contrary, the international balance of payment situation has gotten worse rather than better. But the failure was inevitable, as this was an attempt to do something that is impossible. The reason a nation runs out of foreign exchange is that its international spending, its imports and other foreign expenditures, has exceeded its international income, its exports and other receipts from foreign sources. It has been living on credit and has exhausted that credit. Now it must face the reality that, in the long run, only goods can pay for goods. Principle number 2. No financial juggling, however ingenious, can avoid this unpleasant fact. Unless a gift can be obtained from some other country or from the international community, or the nation is desperate enough to take the drastic step of repudiating the debt, more goods must be produced for export at the expense of the domestic standard of living. The plain truth is that a nation that has no foreign exchange is in the same position as an individual who has no money. It has no purchasing power. The only cure for this disease, lack of purchasing power, is increased production. Because production is the only source of purchasing power, other than gifts from more prosperous nations, which are necessarily limited and temporary. The SDRs, which we just learned, but I didn't announce it, are special drawing rights. The SDR, special drawing rights, and other financial schemes that the international monetary authorities are trying to devise are simply attempts to evade the economic realities. Although the immediate purpose of the special drawing rights was to provide additional credit for nations undergoing what was considered to be a temporary shortage of foreign exchange, the creation of such a support system was influenced to a considerable extent by the desire of the financial authorities to have an international currency, something that would assume the role that gold used to play in an earlier and simpler era. The term paper gold that is widely applied to the special drawing rights is a reflection of the status that it was hoped that they would have in international finance. That hope, however, has no chance of being realized for at least 2 reasons. First, neither these rights nor any other international money has any assured value. Such products are not intrinsic money. They are purely credit money. As such, their value is entirely dependent on the credit of the issuing agency, and under present conditions, an international agency has no credit. The extent to which the rights will be accepted in lieu of money depends on the attitude of individual nations, and it is safe to predict that, after a few sad experiences, the nations that find themselves paying the bills for the extravagances of others will take steps to see that the credit obtained from international agencies is strictly limited. The second reason why an international currency is not feasible under present conditions is the same one that prevents a return to the gold standard and stands in the way of fixed exchange rates. The fact that an international standard of value is impossible as long as each country is free to set wage rates arbitrarily, thus making the true value of its currency arbitrary. It has been proposed that, in order to overcome this objection, the international medium of exchange should be tied to a basket of commodities to stabilize its value, but this does not solve the problem. A basket of commodities is not accepted as money, and therefore is not money. This is just another version of John Law's monetary ideas. Support for the proposals therefore have been limited. In the absence of an international currency, since the demise of the gold standard, it has been necessary to handle international financial transactions by means of various national currencies. For the same reason that resulted in gold displacing the many other types of intrinsic money that have been utilized, there has been a general tendency to use only the most stable of these national currencies as the international standard of value. In order to be stable, in this sense, the currency must be issued by a nation that has a solid political establishment that can be relied upon to maintain a steady course, has an economy that is large enough to accommodate the variations in the international transactions without excessive dislocation of its domestic equilibria, and is relatively resistant to inflationary pressures. On these grounds, the U.S. currency has become the de facto international standard. Just to point out, Larson was writing this, I think, back in the 70s and 80s, and the U.S. currency is now losing that moniker of de facto international standard as we speak. So, I don't know exactly what that means, but let's see what Larson says. Maybe he will talk about losing that standard at a certain point. It must be conceded that U.S. currency is not a fully satisfactory form in which to keep these reserve funds, because their value decreases as inflation reduces the value of the U.S. dollar. But as matters now stand, there is no better alternative. Gold is no longer satisfactory for this purpose, as its value as intrinsic money, that is, its value as a commodity, no longer has much significance. The value now attributed to it contains a large and highly variable speculative component, which means that this value is primarily credit created, in the same sense as the value of currency, without the stability of a government-backed currency. Not sure I understand that, but we'll keep going. The international use of U.S. currency is, in some respects, advantageous to the United States, but it also has some potential dangers that should have serious consideration. The currency holdings in foreign countries are claims against U.S. assets, and they can be used at any time and in any quantity. There is also a possibility that the financial stability of a nation may be called into question for one reason or another. And if the United States were to get into such a position, the huge foreign holdings of U.S. currency could have very damaging effects. As we saw earlier, foreign purchases of U.S. goods raise the general price level in the United States. Large purchases could produce a money inflation that would disrupt the U.S. economy. The dangers inherent in the existence of large foreign holdings of U.S. currency are now greatly increased because they are accompanied by vast amounts of U.S. government and private interest-bearing obligations. A currency crisis resulting from a loss of confidence in the stability of the U.S. economy could easily cause heavy selling, perhaps even panic selling, of these securities and conversion of these claims into goods. This possibility with which we are now faced is something like a run on a bank. Like the banks, we have outstanding a much larger total of obligations payable on demand than we are able to meet on short notice. As in the case of the banks, therefore, our present financial situation is stable only because our creditors do not demand payment of any large portion of these obligations simultaneously. The whole financial structure thus rests on foreign confidence in our economic stability. Whether or not that confidence is justified is a matter of opinion. We must, however, bear in mind that there is a limit to the credit of any institution, even a large and wealthy nation such as the United States. An indication that we may be approaching that limit as these words are being written is the relatively high interest rate that we have to pay in order to attract the amount of foreign money that we need to finance the current budget deficits. Like a shaky business enterprise, we have to pay a substantial premium over what would be the normal rate. In any event, the present policy cannot be continued indefinitely. A run on the bank may or may not be imminent, but it is an ever-present threat. This situation in which the United States now finds itself probably would not have developed if the nation had not become the world's banker. In that case, the United States would have a fairly well-defined credit limit like that of any other nation. But the accumulation of U.S. obligations by foreign nations and individuals as financial reserves has greatly enlarged the amount of U.S. debt that can be absorbed without adverse reactions on the nation's credit. Furthermore, because of the use of U.S. currency as an international standard, the exchange value of this currency is affected by a number of factors other than the true value in terms of goods that determines the exchange value of other currencies. One such factor is the existence of a speculative element in the market evaluation of U.S. currency. An unstable world financial situation, for example, tends to favor investment in the United States. The U.S. interest rate and estimates of its probable trend also have a significant effect. And since a large part of the financial reserves of most foreign nations is maintained in the form of U.S. currency, these nations have a vested interest in the stability of the dollar. Their central banks, therefore, frequently intervene in the currency markets by purchasing or selling dollars to prevent undesired changes in the exchange rates. This special position in world finance has the effect of exempting the United States from some of the restraints that would otherwise limit the extent of the kind of actions that cause trouble. Unfortunately, our nation has been unable to exercise the kind of self-discipline that would take the place of these external restraints. As a consequence, we have succumbed to the financial ailment that is afflicting a large and growing number of the nations of the world, particularly the so-called underdeveloped countries, the borrowing disease. Within the last decade, the United States has borrowed from foreign sources in quantities unprecedented in financial history, solely for the purpose of meeting government deficits, that is, to enable financing government expenditures without having to ask the taxpayers to pay for them. We are raising the money to meet today's expenses by mortgaging the earnings of future generations. In addition to making it relatively easy to borrow from foreigners, the international use of U.S. currency has had the effect of concealing a substantial segment of the national debt. The debt totals, as stated by government agencies and other compilers of economic statistics, include only the interest-bearing portion of the debt. But large amounts of U.S. currency are being held by foreign governments and individuals as financial reserves. These billions of dollars are debts of the United States in exactly the same sense as our government bonds, and they constitute an important part of the debt total. Ironically, the financial policy that the United States has been following in recent years is exactly the same as the policies of many nations, particularly in Africa and Latin America, which the financial experts of our government criticize so strongly. The only real difference is that these nations have realistic credit limits based on the productivity of their economies, and most of them have reached their limits, while our position as the world banker prevents general recognition of the extent to which we are living on credit. Strangely enough, adoption of this policy of reckless borrowing was the work of some of the most conservative elements of American society. After the theory that we can spend ourselves into prosperity, derived from some of Keynes's ideas, was generally recognized as having failed in practice, the pendulum swung back in the other direction. And the ultra-conservatives embraced the idea that the royal road to prosperity was the reduction of government expenditures. This in itself is quite harmless, so far as the general operation of the economy is concerned. But unfortunately, it was coupled with the belief that the government could be starved into economy by reducing taxes. Of course, some justification had to be offered for abandoning what had long been regarded in conservative thinking as fiscal responsibility, and this was provided by a new, or at least rejuvenated, theory known as supply-side economics, which was receiving considerable public attention at the time. According to the proponents of this theory, taxes beyond a certain level bring in less rather than more revenue to the government because of their depressing effect on the volume of business activity. Most economists rejected this theory from the beginning, and experience with its application has disillusioned many of the individuals who originally favored it, so it has relatively little active support at this time. However, the underlying premise of the theory, the supply-side view that taxes are a burden on the economy, has been brought up in other connections, and some comments on its status are therefore in order. Identification of the true cause of unemployment in my book, The Road to Full Employment, which is Larson's other book on economics, makes it evident that under existing conditions, higher business taxes do have some adverse effect on unemployment, on employment. But the theoretical development also shows that this loss of employment can be avoided by relatively simple means. It also demonstrates that taxes on individuals do not have any direct effect on employment. Their impact on business activity in general depends on what the government does with the tax revenues. In this connection, it should be kept in mind that the government is not a separate entity with objectives of its own. It is an agent of the citizens of the nation. Its expenditures are made with funds collected from those citizens and are made for the benefit, presumably at least, of those citizens. The effect on the economy is therefore exactly the same as if the money had been spent for similar products by the citizens themselves. The effect on the individuals is different simply because these individuals, if left to their own inclinations, would buy different products, items on which they place a higher value. It follows that the reduction of taxes on individuals, the largest component of the total tax reduction made for implementation of the supply side theories, had no stimulating effect on business except insofar as the government financed the result deficit by inflationary borrowing or printing money. The policy that was actually followed was to minimize the use of new money and finance the large deficits by borrowing from foreign sources, selling credit goods in the terms used in the theoretical discussion in Chapter 15. This avoided the inflation that otherwise would have produced some of the business expansion that the supply-side economists were counting upon. It also enabled the national administration to claim credit for controlling inflation, although in reality, all that had been done was to postpone it. If past experience is a reliable guide in this instance, supply-side economics will continue to have the support of some economists. Economic theories come and go in the manner of fashions in clothing, but a theory that once gains a measure of acceptance is seldom completely abandoned. However, the legacy that has been left by the supply-side experiment, the huge addition to the national debt, and the continuing budget deficits that are adding to it, will probably preclude any repetition in the foreseeable future. The present concern is with the question as to how to extricate ourselves from the quagmire of debt, an undertaking in which we are handicapped by the fact that we have never, as a nation, arrived at a general policy with respect to living on credit. In any event, it is now clear that financial policies that cause the value of the dollar in foreign markets to diverge substantially from its true value have damaging effects on many segments of the domestic economy, as noted in Chapter 16. It is thus evident that we need some kind of controls over our international dealings that will accomplish the same results as the restraints that are automatically applied to all other countries by the currency exchange rates. Furthermore, it is time for the United States to give some consideration to the effect of U.S. economic policies on the rest of the world. We have assumed a position of leadership in political and economic affairs, at least among the most economically advanced nations, and we should now recognize that this position carries with it some responsibilities. The tie-in between the U.S. and world currencies that has resulted from the international use of U.S. currency has generated a new set of economic problems that have been gradually increasing in severity. The root of these problems is that, as matters now stand, U.S. actions taken for purely domestic reasons have repercussions throughout the world economies. As a well-known aphorism puts it, quote, when the United States catches a cold, the rest of the world has pneumonia. The sheer size of the U.S. economy has something to do with this, of course, but the reliance of the international community on U.S. currency causes the U.S. actions to have results around the world that are not taken into consideration when decisions are made as to U.S. policies. This brings up the question concerning our relations with the rest of the international community. It would seem that the mere fact that we have accepted the kind of a position in the world that makes it possible for us to play a major part in the affairs of other nations imposes on us an obligation to avoid doing harm to the others by our policies. But we have not thus far recognized that obligation. For instance, the high interest the United States has had to offer in order to attract enough foreign money to finance its deficits has drained out of those countries the capital that they need to improve their productive facilities and to meet the requirements of the less affluent nations. Essentially, what has happened is that savings, which should have been invested in productive applications in foreign countries, have been diverted to financing additional consumption in the United States. A close competitor of the huge budget deficit for the dubious distinction of being the domestic economic policy with the most destructive effect on international economic relations is the Federal Reserve System's reliance on an anti-business policy as the primary means of controlling inflation. As noted in the earlier pages, the currently prevailing economic opinion is that there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and that the only way to correct an inflationary situation is to institute a tight credit policy that will reduce business activity and employment. It must be conceded that this policy, if it is carried out with sufficient firmness, is capable of achieving its objective. The slowdown of business activity produces the conditions described in Chapter 14, which lead to a downswing of the business cycle, thereby eliminating or at least reducing money inflation. At the same time, the increased amount of employment dampens the pressure for wage increases and thus reduces cost inflation. Okay, we will get back to the rest of this chapter when we resume tomorrow. And our debt right now is at 34.85 trillion, on its way to 35. And so I guess this is relevant. Thanks for tuning in today, and have